The slap came so suddenly, I barely had time to blink. My reading glasses flew from my face, shattering on the polished floor of the grand ballroom as over 100 wedding guests froze in stunned silence. The sharp sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the ache spreading through my chest. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, had just struck me on her wedding day for refusing to hand over the keys to my own apartment. "That's what you get for being selfish," she screamed, her voice echoing beneath the chandeliers. At 71, I never imagined being humiliated like that, in public, by the woman who had married my only son. But in that moment, among the gasps, the murmurs, the silent stares of people too afraid or indifferent to intervene, something inside me shifted forever. Before we continue, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. This story may echo louder than you expect. What followed after that slap was not just a confrontation, it was a revelation, a reckoning. And by the time it was over, no one in that ballroom would ever look at me or themselves the same way again. I bent down to pick up the broken pieces of my glasses, my hands trembling as 130 guests stood frozen, unsure whether to look away or keep watching the wreckage unfold. Some whispered behind napkins, others stared with morbid curiosity, but not a single soul moved to help, not even my son. Daniel stood there, motionless, his eyes glued to the floor, as if the old man kneeling before him was a stranger. Vanessa, meanwhile, smoothed her gown with regal composure and added, "You're not welcome here anymore. Daniel and I need our privacy. Your apartment would be perfect while we figure out our next steps." Her words dripped with venom, but they were just the latest in a long line of subtle jabs I had endured for over 2 years. I had allowed myself to become a target of her quiet contempt, tolerating the comments about my outdated clothes, my aging pickup truck, even my part-time volunteering at the local library. She saw everything about me as disposable. And Daniel, my boy, the one I had raised alone after his mother passed, he had gradually become her echo, parroting her disdain with a smile. "Dad, maybe it's time to consider downsizing," he had said just months earlier, after another orchestrated dinner full of hollow smiles and awkward silence. "You deserve somewhere easier to manage at your age." I had smiled politely then, brushing it off like dust from an old coat. But that slap, that sharp, calculated performance in front of our entire extended family was not just about a key, it was a declaration. I wasn't family anymore. I was an obstacle. As I slowly made my way toward the exit, leaving the clinking glasses and forced laughter behind, something else stirred inside me. Not shame, not grief, something far older. A kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years, the kind you feel right before a storm rolls in. I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone. My fingers shook, but not from fear, from resolve. I hadn't dialed this number in over a year, not since I thought the worst was behind us. "Louis, it's Vincent," I said, my voice low and firm. "I need you at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, right now. Bring the documents." There was a pause on the line, then his reply. "Are you sure, Mr. Morales? If we do this, there's no going back." I glanced behind me. Vanessa was already laughing with her bridesmaids as if none of it had happened. Daniel stood beside her, nodding absent-mindedly, not even sparing a look toward the man who had raised him from nothing. "I've never been more sure," I said. "Give me 30 minutes." I hung up, stepped outside, and walked to my truck parked in the lot. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty spaces, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. As I sat there waiting, the past few years began flooding back moments I had buried under patience and false hope. I remembered the first time Vanessa stepped into my apartment. Her perfectly manicured hand slid across the old wooden banister, and she wrinkled her nose as if I'd invited her into a museum of bad taste. "This is where your father lives?" she had asked Daniel, just loud enough for me to hear. I saw the way she looked at my furniture, the second-hand bookshelf, the worn-out recliner where I read the newspaper every morning. It was judgment wrapped in politeness. I had spent my life avoiding conflict, choosing peace over pride. But I had also spent decades building a life far different from what anyone, especially Vanessa, suspected. For years I let them think I was just a retired engineer with a modest pension, clinging to his independence. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that my late wife and I had quietly built a fortune. Real estate, investments, trust accounts, all hidden behind the veil of simplicity. We had chosen to live modestly to protect our son from entitlement, to give him a normal childhood, a grounded life. But watching him stand silent while his wife struck me, watching him let them treat me like a burden, they had both forfeited any claim to my silence. My phone buzzed. It was Lewis. "On my way," the message read. I replied with a simple, "Good. Tonight, the masks come off." I took a deep breath and watched the ballroom through the windshield. The lights shimmered. The music played on. Guests laughed and toasted to a future built on a lie. But the truth was coming. And it wouldn't arrive with fire or fury. It would arrive with facts calm, undeniable, and devastating. They thought they were getting an old man's apartment. What they were getting was a reckoning. And by the end of that night, they would know exactly who Vincent Morales really was. The wind rustled gently through the trees as I waited in my truck, the ballroom's golden lights still glittering like a mirage through the windshield. Every few minutes I saw a guest step outside to take a phone call or smoke, none of them suspecting the storm about to roll in. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes, letting the memories come, memories I had spent too long pushing aside. It had all started 2.5 years ago, the night Daniel brought Vanessa to dinner at my apartment. I remember it vividly. He had that nervous, boyish smile I hadn't seen since he was 13, and broke my garage window playing baseball. "Dad, I want you to meet someone special," he had said. Vanessa walked in wearing a dress that looked like it cost more than my truck, her makeup flawless, her hair not a strand out of place. She smiled at me, but her eyes didn't. They scanned the apartment like a property inspector, stopping at the faded curtains, the outdated kitchen tiles, the small living room with mismatched furniture. "How cozy," she said, her tone saying otherwise. I remember the way Daniel beamed beside her, oblivious to the judgment curling at the edge of her mouth. That first dinner was all pretense, mine and hers. I had cooked herbed roast chicken, the kind Daniel loved as a kid. She barely touched it, citing some carb avoidance diet. When I asked about her family, she gave me vague answers, then smoothly redirected the conversation to my finances. "It must be hard living on a pension these days," she said with what she probably thought was subtle concern. I chuckled politely, but a small warning bell rang in my mind. I'd worked too long with structural engineers not to recognize stress fractures when I saw them, and something about Vanessa didn't add up. In the months that followed, the cracks deepened. Every visit came with more comments. "Vincent, you should really consider assisted living. It's safer at your age." Or, "I saw a place with a medical staff on site and meal plans. Just perfect for a man who shouldn't be worrying about cleaning or cooking anymore." Behind every suggestion was the same message. "You don't belong here. You don't deserve this space anymore." And always, her eyes lingered on the apartment itself, on the high ceilings, the balcony view of the city, the square footage far too generous for a retired old man. At first I dismissed it as youthful arrogance. But one afternoon, after Daniel had stepped into the bathroom, I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. "Yes, Mom," she whispered, unaware that I was still within earshot. "His apartment is in a prime district. If we convince him to move out, we could stay here while we save up. He's so out of touch he'll probably thank us for the idea." Her words sliced deeper than any insult ever could. That was the moment I stopped pretending. From then on, I played the role she expected, the feeble, clueless father-in-law in worn shoes and clearance rack flannels. But while she was plotting, so was I. I began collecting information, patterns, evidence. I took notes. I called in favors. I reached out to Amelia, a longtime friend from my construction days who now worked in real estate. "Do a background check on Daniel and Vanessa," I said, quietly. What she found chilled me. They were drowning in debt. Vanessa's lifestyle, her designer bags, spa weekends, curated social media photo shoots, was financed almost entirely through credit cards and loans. Their current apartment was 3 months behind on rent. Daniel's income, while stable, was nowhere near enough to support the illusion they had built. They had taken out a $65,000 loan for the wedding alone. My apartment wasn't just a preference. It was their lifeline. But that wasn't the worst of it. According to the financial reports, Daniel had begun inquiring about elderly guardianship laws, specifically how to obtain financial control over an aging parent deemed incompetent. The son I had raised with Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories was now preparing to strip me of everything legally, methodically, and without shame. I remember sitting in my chair that night, staring at the same walls Vanessa had once judged, wondering how we'd gotten here. I had already been quietly helping him for years, paying off his credit cards, sending anonymous bonuses to cover car insurance, negotiating lower rent with his landlord without his knowledge. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was helping him stay afloat during a rough patch. But all I had done was enable him to become someone I no longer recognized. And Vanessa, she hadn't changed. She had simply removed the mask. Just 2 weeks before the wedding, they staged what Vanessa called an important family discussion. They arrived with her parents in tow, two people who looked at me the way developers look at a condemned property, full of potential, but inconveniently occupied. "Vincent," her father began, "we think it's time for you to make responsible decisions for your future." They spoke about retirement communities, about safety risks, about loneliness and aging. Then, finally, they said it. Selling this apartment would give you peace of mind and help Daniel and Vanessa build a future. Their faces were sincere, practiced, ruthless. I sipped my tea and said nothing. But inside, something had turned to stone. That night, after they left, I called Lewis. "Prepare the papers," I said. "Every document. I want a full suspension of transfers, account access, everything. We go public if they cross one more line." He asked if I was ready. I told him I had been ready for years. I just hadn't admitted it to myself. And now, sitting in the parking lot, watching the sparkle of the chandeliers and the silhouettes of dancers inside, I realized this wasn't just about money or property. It was about dignity. And tonight, they were about to learn what happens when a man they thought was broken decides he's had enough. 27 minutes had passed since I made the call. Lewis was never late. I sat behind the wheel, the engine off, the world outside silent except for the muffled thump of bass leaking through the ballroom windows. Laughter rose and fell like waves crashing against a shore I no longer belonged to. I could almost picture Daniel and Vanessa inside, relishing what they thought was their triumph. I imagined Vanessa regaling her friends with the story, how she had finally put the old man in his place. The narrative was simple and cruel. The senile father-in-law who refused to hand over a key, punished with a slap that the bride insisted was deserved, and Daniel, standing beside her, letting it all unfold without protest, was no longer the boy I raised. I don't know when I lost him. Maybe it was gradual like erosion, not explosion. But tonight would mark where the line was drawn. Not because I was out for revenge, but because I was done tolerating disrespect. My phone buzzed. "I'm pulling into the side lot now," Lewis texted. I stepped out of the truck, straightened my jacket, and took a deep breath. The cool air bit at my skin, but I welcomed it. Clarity always came with cold. From across the lot, I saw headlights flick on and a sleek black sedan come to a stop. Lewis stepped out, briefcase in hand, his tailored coat brushing his knees. "Mr. Morales," he said with a slight bow of the head, "everything's prepared." "Are you still certain?" I looked him in the eye, steady and clear. "I'm more certain now than I was 30 minutes ago." He nodded once, then opened his briefcase under the light of a flickering lamppost. Inside were folders labeled meticulously: transfer termination, lease withdrawal, payment reversal, and perhaps the most painful, will revision. "This," he said, holding up the first document, "immediately suspends the $5,000 monthly transfers you've been wiring into Daniel's account. No more payments toward rent, car, or credit card debt." He handed it to me, and I signed without hesitation. "This next one," he continued, "notifies the property owner of their current apartment that you are withdrawing as guarantor. They'll have 30 days to provide a replacement or vacate." Another signature, another thread cut. "And the wedding?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The venue contract is voided. They'll have until morning to settle the $60,000 bill themselves. Or face legal action from the event planner." My pen hit the paper like a final nail. My hand didn't shake. If anything, it felt lighter. "This isn't revenge, Lewis," I said as we walked toward the entrance. "It's consequence. They need to learn that kindness is not the same as weakness." He nodded silently, walking a step behind me as we approached the ballroom doors. The music was louder now, the kind of artificial joy that coats everything in glitter to hide the cracks. I placed my hand on the door and paused, not out of doubt but out of recognition. This was the moment I stopped being the man they thought they could manipulate. I pushed the door open. The music cut out like a snapped string. Conversations died. Heads turned. 130 pairs of eyes landed on the doorway where I stood, flanked by a man in a charcoal overcoat holding legal documents. Some guests blinked, unsure what they were seeing. Others looked at their phones, anticipating drama. Vanessa saw me first. She stood near the cake, mid-photo, her veil cascading down her back. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice already rising. "Didn't you humiliate yourself enough?" She didn't notice Lewis step forward until he raised his voice polished, steady, the kind you hear in courtrooms and boardrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but I have urgent legal business with Mr. Daniel Morales and Mrs. Vanessa Grant." Whispers swept through the room like wind through dry leaves. Daniel approached, his face flushed, clearly not understanding what was unfolding. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" he asked, glancing from me to Lewis and back. "Who is this?" "This," I said calmly, "is Mr. Carter, my attorney. He's here to deliver a few important updates, starting with the fact that I am no longer your financial safety net." Lewis opened his folder and began reading. "Mr. Morales, effective immediately, all financial support previously provided to you by Mr. Vincent Morales has been terminated. This includes monthly deposits, rental guarantees, and all wedding-related expenses." A gasp spread through the crowd like wildfire. Vanessa stormed forward, disbelief painted across her face. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked. "You don't have any money. You live like a pauper in that dusty apartment. You drive a truck from the Jurassic era." "Appearances deceive, Vanessa," I replied evenly. "That apartment is the smallest property I own. And that truck? It's older than your marriage barely, but it's never let me down." She looked around, expecting support, but found only stunned faces and raised phones. Several guests had begun recording, sensing that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be forgotten. Lewis pulled out the final document. Furthermore, the estate of Mr. Morales has been officially revised. All inheritance previously designated for Daniel Morales has now been transferred to the Morales Foundation for the Protection of Seniors from Financial Abuse. Effective today. The silence that followed was complete. No music, no movement, just the sound of reality crashing down in real time. Vanessa stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as something far worse to her kind. A man with power who had finally decided to use it. Daniel stumbled backward. "Dad, you can't do this. You're my father." "Exactly," I replied. "And a father teaches lessons. Even the painful ones. You too mistook patience for permission. And tonight, that ends." Daniel stood there, lips parted, eyes wide, as if I had just spoken in a language he no longer understood. Maybe I had. Maybe the man he remembered, the quiet father with frugal habits and a soft voice, never raised his tone because he believed in grace, not because he lacked conviction. But this wasn't that man. That man had been dismissed with a slap in a ballroom. What stood before him now was someone he had pushed too far. "You've been paying for everything?" he asked quietly, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. "The apartment, the car, the wedding?" 4 years, I replied. 4 years of covering your rent behind the scenes, of sending anonymous bank transfers so you didn't lose your car, of pretending your promotion bonuses were real while I wired money every month to keep your heads above water. All because I thought maybe you'd find your footing." Vanessa shook her head like a child rejecting a nightmare. "No," she snapped. "This is some kind of twisted act. You're a lonely old man with a martyr complex. You can't just pull the rug out from under your own son's wedding because you feel left out." "Oh, I didn't feel left out," I said with a calm smile. "I felt disposable. And that's a lesson you'll never learn until the ATM says declined." There were murmurs now, guests whispering, some shifting uncomfortably. Some were already filming. I saw one older woman at a table near the back wipe a tear from her cheek, whispering something to the man beside her. Not all the audience was cold. Some knew the pain behind my poise. Lewis stepped forward once more. The financial responsibility for this evening's event, including venue, catering, entertainment, and photography, totaling approximately $60,000, now falls fully on Mr. and Mrs. Morales. The guarantee provided by Mr. Vincent Morales has been formally revoked. You could hear the collective inhale of 100 people. Then silence, like the eye of a storm. Vanessa swayed slightly, her heels suddenly too tall, her dress too heavy. "We don't have that kind of money," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. "You knew that." Her voice was losing its edge now, replaced by panic. "This was supposed to be our beginning." "No," I said, my voice low but resolute. "It was supposed to be your takeover of my apartment, my dignity, my life. But you forgot one thing. I've built too many things from the ground up to hand anything over to people who never learned how to build it all." Daniel took a step closer. "Dad, please. We made mistakes. But this? You're burning it all down." I met his eyes, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the boy he once was. The boy who made me birthday cards out of notebook paper, who sat on my shoulders to watch fireworks. "You burned it, son, when you stood by while I was slapped. When you called my independence selfish. When you plotted to take what I've worked for, not because you needed it to survive, but because it was easier than earning it yourself." Vanessa collapsed into a nearby chair, face in her hands, sobbing in a way that drew neither sympathy nor comfort. The room was still, thick with judgment, but I didn't speak to wound, I spoke to liberate. Not just myself, but everyone who had ever been made to feel small because of age, modesty, or kindness mistaken for naivety. Lewis looked at me as if to ask, "Is there more?" I nodded. "Yes," I said, turning to face the room. "To everyone here, let this be a reminder. Wealth doesn't always dress in designer suits or drive luxury cars. Sometimes it shops at thrift stores and drives a beat-up Ford because it values privacy over vanity. And sometimes that quiet dignity is tested until it's not." I turned back to Daniel. "You wanted to build your future on top of me, and now you'll have to build it without me." Daniel looked broken, not just emotionally but structurally, like a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed under the weight of truth. And it had, because behind every quiet parent is often a lion waiting not to roar, but to remind the world that survival taught them how. Lewis packed the documents back into his briefcase. Vanessa muttered something under her breath, but I didn't catch it. It didn't matter. The chapter had closed. The guests were beginning to rise, some leaving, others lingering with stunned expressions. As Lewis and I turned toward the doors, the ballroom felt smaller behind us. I didn't feel old. He felt unborn. And as we walked into the night, I knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something long overdue. Not revenge, not cruelty, just consequence, just truth. And finally, peace. 3 days had passed since the wedding, though it felt like a lifetime. My apartment, once a space shadowed by tension and unspoken fears, had become a sanctuary of calm. The air was lighter, the silence no longer oppressive but peaceful. My mornings now started with fresh pastries and strong coffee, courtesy of Raymond, my neighbor, my friend, my brother in everything but blood. "You know," he said that morning as he sat at my kitchen table, "I've lived in this building for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone pull off what you did. That wasn't just self-respect, Vincent. That was an act of war, and you won it with a whisper." I smiled and stirred my coffee, though deep down there was a weight I hadn't shaken yet. I hadn't heard from Daniel. Not a word, not a knock on the door, not a message, not even an apology dressed as an excuse. Vanessa, on the other hand, had sent 6 texts in the past 72 hours, each more frantic and guilt-laced than the last. The last one had simply read, "He's not sleeping, he's not eating, you destroyed your son." But I hadn't destroyed anyone. I had only removed the crutch that allowed them to keep limping through life, dragging everyone else down with them. Lewis had called that same morning to give me the full picture. "Mr. Morales," he said in his usual measured tone, "as expected, the venue has initiated legal action for non-payment. The $60,000 invoice now sits squarely in their lap, Creditors are circling, cards have been frozen, their landlord is filing for eviction next week. And where are they now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Staying with Vanessa's parents, Lewis replied. 3 adults, 1 toddler, and now 2 more in a 2-bedroom apartment. I let out a breath through my nose, not satisfaction, but confirmation. The inevitable had arrived. I spent that afternoon trimming the balcony plants, while a light breeze carried the smell of late summer across the city. That's when I saw Sophie's car pull into the lot. She stepped out quickly, but she wasn't alone. With her was Raymond, and to my surprise, Amelia, my longtime friend from the real estate world who had helped me uncover the initial financial lies. The 3 of them walked up to my apartment with a sense of urgency that made my chest tighten. "Vincent," Sophie said, hugging me tightly at the door, "we need to talk, and you're not going to like it." She carried a folder in her hand, thick, sealed, official, the kind of folder that usually only means one thing: a mess. They sat me down in the living room, and Amelia opened the file. "They filed a petition," she said. "Daniel is claiming you're mentally unstable. Vanessa has been telling neighbors you're having cognitive issues. They're building a case for guardianship." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The air in the room chilled. "They're trying to take everything you own, Vincent," Raymond added. "Not through lies in private anymore, but through court." I remained still, listening. "The worst part," Sophie said softly, "is that they're using the events of the wedding as evidence that your public appearance, the emotional outburst, the cancellation of payments, they're saying it proves you're not of sound mind." I laughed not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "They humiliated me in front of 130 people," I said, "and now they're using my response to their abuse as proof I'm unstable?" "Exactly," Amelia replied. "They're counting on the fact that people will see an old man reacting emotionally and assume frailty instead of justice." But what they didn't realize was that the internet had its own version of truth. Raymond, who had become unexpectedly tech-savvy in his retirement, pulled out his phone. "You're going viral, Vincent," he said. "A few guests posted videos from the ballroom, your speech, Lewis reading the documents, Vanessa's breakdown. It's been viewed over 1 million times. And the comments? 99% are on your side." He handed me the phone and I scrolled. "This man is a legend. Every parent being used for money should watch this. We need laws protecting people like him." The flood of support didn't just counteract the guardianship claim, it detonated it. Lewis called again later that evening. "I've spoken to 2 elder law specialists," he said. "Between the video evidence, your financial records, and the public support, their case is already collapsing. We'll file a counterclaim for defamation and attempt to block any further legal harassment." I hung up the phone and sat in silence, feeling the paradox of heartbreak and vindication. Daniel had crossed the line again, not just morally, but legally. And yet, I wasn't angry. I was done being angry. I had spent too long mourning the illusion of who he used to be. What I felt now was something quieter, colder acceptance. As the sun began to set, casting gold across the living room floor, I walked over to my old desk. I opened the drawer and pulled out a folder I had started assembling the day after the wedding. Inside were my own records, copies of payments, text transcripts, photographs of my bruised cheek from the slap. I wasn't preparing for war. I was documenting the truth, because they had taken my silence for weakness. But silence, I had learned, is only power when it ends at the right time. That night, as the city lights blinked to life and the noise of traffic rose in the distance, I poured myself a drink and stood by the window. Vanessa and Daniel had set their own trap. All I had done was stop protecting them from it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for their downfall. I felt free. 6 months later, I found myself sitting beneath stage lights in a television studio, mic clipped to my collar, palms resting on my knees, steady but still. The show was called Voices That Matter, and apparently mine had become one. Across from me sat a respected journalist named Catherine Diaz, known for treating her guests with curiosity rather than spectacle. "Mr. Morales," she began with that measured voice made for prime time, "your story has touched millions. Your courage has sparked national conversation about financial abuse within families. But I want to ask, 6 months later, how do you feel sitting here, knowing how far this has reached. I looked at her, then directly at the camera. I feel like I finally came home to myself, I said. And in doing so, I found out how many people had been living my story in silence. The weeks following the wedding fallout had unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. Daniel and Vanessa's attempt to declare me mentally unfit had collapsed in spectacular fashion. Once the court saw the videos, the financial records, the pattern of coercion and abuse, it was over before it began. Their lawyer withdrew. The judge admonished them publicly, and perhaps most crushing for them, the story went viral. What they thought would shame me ended up becoming a spotlight, and it didn't shine in their favor. Catherine leaned in. "You could have disappeared quietly, Mr. Morales. No one would have blamed you, but instead, you founded a nonprofit. You went public. You wrote a book. Why?" I smiled, not the kind of smile that masks pain, but the kind that comes from purpose. "Because there's a Vincent Morales in every neighborhood," I said. A man, a woman, a grandmother, a grandfather, quietly being drained by people they love, too ashamed to admit it, too tired to fight. I had resources, I had support, but most don't. I had to use what I'd been given to create something bigger than myself. The Morales Foundation for the Protection of Seniors launched just 2 months after that night. Louis became its financial director. Sophie left her teaching job to become our education coordinator. Amelia volunteered to lead our property rights task force. And Raymond, bless him, became our honorary community watchdog, giving weekly talks at senior centers on spotting manipulation, complete with PowerPoint slides and donuts. We didn't just help people file paperwork, we helped them take their power back. In 6 months, we'd already helped 200 seniors recover stolen assets, cancel abusive guardianship filings, or secure restraining orders against manipulative relatives. And every week, the letters kept coming. Catherine held up a copy of my book, When Silence Ends, A Father's Reckoning. "This memoir has sold over 150,000 copies, she said. But the final chapter, the one about your son, it's incredibly raw. Did you think twice about being that honest?" "No," I said simply, "because honesty is what saved me. And maybe it'll save someone else." I didn't write to punish Daniel. I wrote to document the unraveling of a bond that used to mean everything, and how painful it is to realize that love by itself cannot undo entitlement. You can raise a child with values, with sacrifices, with all the love in the world, and still, one day, that child can look at you not as a parent, but as a stepping stone. Vanessa had tried contacting me twice after the fallout. Once, through a voicemail that started with, "I know we messed up," and ended with, "But we're having a baby, and you wouldn't let your grandchild suffer, would you?" The second time, it was a letter rambling, guilt-laced, and once again, about money. I didn't respond to either. Not because I didn't care, but because I had finally accepted that helping them didn't save them. It only delayed their reckoning. Catherine leaned back. "If Daniel is watching this interview right now, do you have anything you'd like to say?" The question was inevitable, and it still stung. I turned back toward the camera, and I spoke not to the man who betrayed me, but to the boy who used to race through our hallway with untied shoes and a scraped knee. "Daniel, if you're watching, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never will. But love isn't silence, and love without boundaries becomes enabling. You didn't lose my love. You lost access to my peace, my resources, and my trust. When you're ready to rebuild, not with charm, not with apologies, but with humility and work, I'll be here, but not a moment sooner." The studio went quiet. The crew, the producer, even Catherine sat still in the moment. Because they knew they weren't just hearing about a family's collapse, they were witnessing what happens when someone chooses self-respect over bloodline. As the show wrapped and the applause began, I shook Catherine's hand, then turned to walk off stage. Raymond met me in the green room with a grin. Well, if they didn't get the message before, they sure as hell have it now. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and a blanket. The city hummed in the distance. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for a phone call or an apology. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because everything had gone the way I wanted, but because I had finally remembered who I was and refused to let anyone else forget it again. 2 years have passed since the night my son's wedding unraveled into a lesson the world hadn't expected to learn but desperately needed to. I'm writing this now from the same balcony where I once stood with bruised pride and a folder of truths. Back then, I couldn't have imagined what would come next. I had only hoped for peace. What I found instead was purpose. These days, my mornings begin with a call from Marisol, the operations manager of the Morales Foundation. "We've got 9 new cases this week," she told me just yesterday. Mostly the same pattern: children manipulating elderly parents into selling homes, signing over accounts, covering debts disguised as emergencies. Every time I hear those stories, it's like I'm reading a chapter from my own life, only with different names and slightly different heartbreaks. A retired nurse in Michigan forced into a retirement home so her son could flip her house. A widowed grandfather in Texas whose granddaughter drained his savings and disappeared. The details vary, but the damage feels the same, and we fight for them. With every case we take, every dollar we recover, every hearing we attend on behalf of someone too scared or tired to stand up for themselves, I feel a little more healed. We've grown. The Foundation now has 2 satellite offices, 10 staff members, 3 attorneys on retainer, and over 700 documented cases resolved. But our proudest accomplishment isn't measured in money, it's measured in dignity restored. Raymond, who still lives in the apartment next to mine, has become our most enthusiastic volunteer. At 76, he walks into senior centers with a confidence that puts younger men to shame. "I'm not old," he told a room full of veterans last week. "I'm seasoned, and seasoned folks don't get fooled twice." The room erupted in applause. His talks have become legendary, part legal seminar, part comedy routine, always ending with, "And if they try to gaslight you into silence, you call us. We'll turn the gas off." The man has become our unofficial slogan. Sophie, who once ran to me in tears the night of the wedding, now leads our education outreach. She writes curriculum, organizes community training, and mentors at-risk seniors who feel alone. One day, she pulled me aside after a seminar and said, "You know what I've learned? That family is a privilege, not a pass. And that some of the strongest people I've ever met are seniors who finally chose to stop being polite and start being heard." I hugged her without saying a word. She had learned the truth the hard way, just like I had. As for Daniel, well, I've only heard from him 3 times in the last 2 years. The first was 6 months after the court ruling, when he emailed me a single line, "I hope you're satisfied." I didn't respond. The second was after Vanessa left him, took their child, what was left of their furniture, and apparently his credit. He called late one evening, drunk or broken or both. I didn't answer that one either. The third time was more recent. He left a voicemail. "Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. Oliver keeps asking about his grandfather. I don't know what to tell him." That one made me sit down for a long while. I replayed it once, then deleted it. I do think about Oliver, my grandson. He's almost 2 now. I've never held him, never seen his eyes or heard his laugh, except through photos forwarded by someone who still speaks to Vanessa. But I've started something for him, a trust fund, structured carefully, locked tight, inaccessible to anyone but him when he turns 21. By then, I hope he'll be curious. I hope he'll come find me, not for money, but for truth. And when he does, I'll be here. If not in person, then in the legacy I've built. At my age, you learn that peace doesn't come from forgiveness alone. It comes from creating distance where needed, and bridges only where they won't burn again. I don't wish Daniel harm, but I also don't owe him repair. That's a journey he has to take on his own. Earlier this week, I gave a lecture at a university, one of many I now do across the country. The topic was Invisible Exploitation, the Economics of Elder Abuse. As I walked off stage, a young woman approached me in tears. "My dad is going through something similar," she said. "He's too proud to admit it. But after hearing you, maybe I can help him." I shook her hand and smiled. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't speaking up," I said. "It's believing that you deserve to be heard." Tonight, as the city buzzes below and the air carries the soft sounds of life moving on, I sit with a cup of tea and a journal. The apartment once seen by Vanessa as a prize to be conquered is still mine. But more than that, it finally feels like home again. Not because of what's in it, but because of who I've become inside it. There's an old saying, you teach people how to treat you by what you allow. For far too long, I allowed silence to speak for me. I let love become a license, let family become a shield for unacceptable behavior. Not anymore. Now I teach by example, and the lesson is clear. Kindness is not weakness, and dignity is not optional. It is earned, protected, and if necessary, reclaimed, even at 73, especially at 73. Last month, I stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Aging with a folder in my hands and resolve in my spine. The room was cold, clinical, full of polished wood and sharper agendas. But I wasn't intimidated. I had faced sharper things in silk dresses and expensive heels. Chairwoman Lancaster, members of the committee, I began. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Vincent Morales. I'm 73 years old. I'm a retired civil engineer, a widower, a father, and the founder of a nonprofit that exists because I learned firsthand what it feels like to be treated as disposable by the people you love most. The silence that followed wasn't discomfort, it was respect. I had learned to recognize the difference. Behind me sat Sophie and Raymond, both dressed professionally, both watching like proud family members. A few feet away sat Louis, surrounded by boxes of research and case summaries. In front of me sat senators who'd only read the statistics until now. In 2 years, I continued, our foundation has handled over 700 cases of elder financial abuse, 80% of which involved direct family members. The stories vary, some subtle, some violent, but the thread is the same. Manipulation wrapped in affection, exploitation disguised as care. I paused, then added, and it's happening in silence, every single day. After my testimony, the questions came. Thoughtful ones mostly. But one senator, well-meaning, I'm sure, asked, Mr. Morales, do you regret going public? Do you regret airing something so personal? I smiled. Not out of smugness, but out of truth. I don't regret telling my story, I said. I regret how long I kept it quiet. Because the longer I protected those who hurt me, the more power they had to keep doing it. I left that room with a dozen hands shaken and a promise from 2 senators to co-sponsor a bill increasing penalties for elder coercion and tightening guardianship laws. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And sometimes, change starts with a single sentence spoken by someone they didn't expect to speak. A few days later, I returned home to find a package on my doorstep. No name, no return address, just a plain envelope tucked inside. I brought it to the kitchen and opened it slowly. Inside was a photo. A small boy, maybe 2 years old, sitting on a swing. His smile crooked, eyes bright. On the back was a single line, scribbled in handwriting I recognized immediately. His name is Oliver. I told him about you. There was no signature, but it didn't need one. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the photo in my hand, my thumb brushing over the edge. I wasn't foolish enough to believe this meant reconciliation, but it meant something had shifted. Maybe not in Daniel, but maybe, just maybe, in the boy who still had time to grow up without inherited bitterness. I placed the photo in the drawer beside the trust documents, next to a letter I'd written months ago that began, To my grandson, if you ever want to know the truth. One day he might read it. One day he might ask questions no one else wanted to answer, and when he does, he'll find a story waiting, written with honesty, not vengeance. My daily life is quieter now, but never still. The foundation has expanded into 3 regional hubs. We've hired more attorneys, more caseworkers, more translators for underserved communities. Every week, I sit with someone who reminds me of who I used to be, someone clinging to love while being bled dry by it. I never tell them what to do. I just listen, and when they're ready, I show them where the door island and how to walk through it with their dignity intact. Sophie lives in the unit next to mine now. Her marriage didn't survive the storm of truth she found herself in after my story went public. But she tells me often, losing what wasn't right for me helped me find what was. She's happier now, anchored in purpose, not pretense. We take walks in the evenings, visit the local garden, where she's teaching older residents to grow herbs and small vegetables. It's funny, she said last week, kneeling beside a tomato plant, how something as simple as planting your own food can feel like reclaiming control. I nodded. Because it is, I said. As for Raymond, well, he's become something of a local celebrity. He's been invited to speak at 2 national aging conferences, both of which he accepted, provided they let him bring his homemade brownies. No one listens to a man with a slideshow, he told them, but everyone listens to the guy who brings dessert. He's not wrong. Sometimes I still think about Vanessa. I hear snippets through shared contacts. She's rebuilding her image, now leaning into motherhood as branding. I don't hate her. I did, briefly, but hate is heavy, and I've learned to put things down that don't nourish me. She made choices. So did I, and so did Daniel. His last message was short. A text, not a call. I see what you're doing. I get it now. I'm sorry it took so long. I didn't reply. Not because I'm angry, but because apologies mean very little when they come only after consequence. Growth is a private journey, and he still has a long road ahead. Tonight, as I sit at my desk finishing this chapter, the city hums below. A copy of my second book, Strong Roots, Growing Dignity After Betrayal, sits beside me, set to publish next month. The dedication reads, "To those who were told they were too old, too soft, or too silent, may your voice be the loudest thing they remember. Because if there's one thing I've learned after 73 years, it's this. Survival is not the same as living, and dignity is not given. It's claimed, reclaimed, and fiercely defended no matter how late you start." This morning, I stood in front of a classroom of law students, eager, sharp-eyed, barely old enough to rent a car, teaching them not just the legal definition of elder abuse, but the anatomy of betrayal. Not the textbook version, but the lived one. I told them how it starts, soft as a suggestion. "You shouldn't be living alone, Dad." Or, "Let me help you manage your money." I watched their expressions shift as I described how that concern can calcify into control, how affection can become leverage, and how family, when left unchecked by boundaries, can turn into a quiet form of theft, not of property, but of identity. And then I told them my story, not for sympathy, for clarity, because understanding the law means nothing if you don't understand the people it's meant to protect. When class ended, one student lingered behind. She looked maybe 22, all nerves and sincerity. "Mr. Morales," she said, "do you ever wish things had ended differently with your son?" I smiled gently. The kind of smile you give when the answer is too big for a single sentence. "I used to," I said. "Now I just wish I'd ended it sooner." It's strange the way grief changes shape over time. In the early days it was sharp, immediate, like glass underfoot. Now it's quieter. Not gone, but worn down into something I can carry without bleeding. I grieve the relationship I thought I had. I grieve the man I believed my son would become. But I don't grieve the decision to walk away. That I've never questioned, not once. In many ways, my life now is fuller than it's ever been. The foundation is thriving. We've partnered with hospitals, banks, even churches, any institution where trust is handed over too easily. Our latest program, Know the Signs, trains pharmacists and tellers to recognize patterns in elder financial abuse. Sudden withdrawals, new caregivers hovering too close, confusion over paperwork that used to be second nature. The results have been staggering. We've prevented over $2 million in fraudulent transfers in just 6 months. But more than the money, we've restored agency to people who thought they'd already been erased. At home, the apartment is still the same. Modest furniture, warm lighting, photos of people who no longer call but once mattered. I've added new ones, too. Smiling seniors holding framed deeds, hugging social workers, planting gardens. Victories captured in still moments. I keep a corkboard in my office with thank you notes pinned across it. My favorite is from an 1-year-old woman named Judith. "You didn't just save my house. You reminded me that I'm still the one who gets to decide what happens in it." Sometimes, when I walk through the neighborhood, people stop me. Strangers. "You're that guy," they say, a little hesitant, a little in awe. I always answer the same way. I'm just someone who got tired of being quiet. And it's true, I didn't set out to be an example. I set out to survive. The rest followed when I stopped apologizing for doing so. Last week, I received a letter handwritten, shaky but unmistakable, from Daniel. No return address. Just 4 pages, folded carefully. He wrote about Oliver, now almost 3. How he asks about me. How he's smart, curious, and already a better man than either of his parents were at that age. The letter wasn't a plea. It was an acknowledgement. I didn't understand what I was doing until I had someone small looking up at me with complete trust, he wrote. And now I see what I did to the one person who gave me that first. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just folded the letter and tucked it next to Oliver's photo in my desk drawer. Maybe one day I'll respond. Maybe I won't. Some stories don't need tidy endings. They need space. Tonight, I'll light a candle, pour a glass of wine, and sit on the balcony that's seen me through everything. The skyline hasn't changed, but I have. 2 years ago, I walked into a ballroom thinking I was alone. Now, I walk into rooms full of people who see me for who I am, and who refuse to let others be silenced like I once was. I've learned that sometimes the most radical act of love isn't staying for family. It's leaving, so you don't lose yourself in the process. And I've learned, finally, that dignity is not something you wait to be given. It's something you reclaim, boldly, quietly, unapologetically, at any age. Tonight, as the city hums gently in the background and a spring breeze moves through the curtains, I sit at my desk and write, not for the headlines, not for the next speech, but for myself, for the man who, 2 years ago, walked out of a ballroom with broken glasses, a bruised cheek, and something far more important, clarity. I think often about how different my life could have been if I had handed over those keys that night. If I had smiled, swallowed my pride, and let them walk away with everything I had built, not just the apartment, but the self-respect I had guarded quietly for decades. On paper, it would have been easier. But I would have disappeared piece by piece, the way so many people our age do, slowly erased by 1,000 tiny compromises, dressed up as family. I've come to understand that reclaiming your voice doesn't always sound like a roar. Sometimes it sounds like the soft click of a pen signing a boundary into permanence. Sometimes it's the silence that follows when you choose not to answer the phone, not to defend yourself, not to chase love that has conditions attached. And sometimes it's as simple as standing still while everyone else spins the narrative and letting the truth speak for itself. People ask me all the time now, would you do it again? And the answer is yes. Every difficult conversation, every uncomfortable truth, every lonely evening in the beginning, I would do it all again. Because what I got in return wasn't just peace. It was integrity. It was the ability to look at myself in the mirror and know I hadn't given up who I was to keep someone else comfortable. I didn't sacrifice 30 years of work, and sacrifice so my son could live a lie. I didn't survive heartbreak, grief, and long nights of solitude just to become someone's retirement plan. The foundation continues to grow. We just opened our 4th location in Seattle. Raymond wants to fly out to cut the ribbon. As long as they let me speak, he told me, half joking. Sophie is working on a national curriculum for high schoolers' financial literacy with a focus on protecting their future elderly selves. She says if we teach them early what manipulation looks like, maybe fewer of them will become the ones wielding it later. I believe her. I believe in all of them. And me? I'm still here. Still living in the same apartment, still tending my balcony plants, still hosting Sunday coffee with neighbors who've become chosen family. I'm not waiting for Daniel to come back. I'm not waiting for closure. Because some doors aren't meant to be reopened, just respectfully locked behind us, so we can move forward without dragging the past into every room we enter. When I think about legacy now, I don't think about money or property. I think about the letters we receive each week, about the seniors who walk into our offices with their heads down and leave with their shoulders a little straighter, about the small victories like a woman keeping her home or a man finally saying no to a manipulative child without guilt. If there's one thing I want people to remember from all of this, it's simple. You are not selfish for choosing self-preservation. You are not cruel for demanding respect. And you are not alone. Not anymore. Not as long as there are voices like ours willing to speak and ears willing to listen. I was once a quiet man in the corner of a room where no one was looking. Now, I speak into microphones, stand behind podiums, and sit across from lawmakers, but I'm still the same man, just finally unafraid to be seen. This afternoon I sat beneath the old oak tree in the community garden we started last year, the one that grew out of a simple idea. What if healing could take root in the soil? Around me, a dozen seniors moved slowly but deliberately, their hands deep in earth, their voices rising in soft conversation. Margaret was trimming rosemary for the senior center kitchen. Jose was teaching a new volunteer how to plant cucumbers in raised beds. And beside me, a woman named Helen told me, with a mixture of pride and disbelief, that after 40 years of silence, she'd finally taken her name off the joint account her grandson had drained for years. He called me cruel, she said, brushing soil from her gloves. I told him cruelty is pretending to love someone while stealing from them. She looked up at me with a grin. Sound familiar? I smiled back, not with sadness, but with the deep satisfaction that comes when a story you once thought would end in pain becomes a map for someone else's survival. There's a kind of dignity that grows in places like this, in raised beds and compost piles and conversations over lemon balm tea. We don't talk much about what was taken anymore. We talk about what we're building now. The seniors who come here aren't victims, they're architects. They plant tomatoes next to the people who help them file restraining orders. They weed flower beds alongside volunteers who walk them through revoking exploitative powers of attorney. Healing here doesn't wear a white coat. It wears a sun hat and carries a pair of gardening shears. Back at home, the apartment looks much the same, simple, neat, quiet. But the man who lives here is not the same man who once sat in the dark, trying to make sense of betrayal that wore his son's face. I move differently now. Not faster, not louder, just with more certainty. I don't explain myself as often. I don't feel the need to justify boundaries. When people ask how I managed to bounce back, I tell them the truth. I didn't bounce. I rebuilt slowly, quietly, brick by brick. I let the pain guide me without becoming my identity. I let the anger pass through me without unpacking its bags. I learned to live without applause. And eventually, I learned to feel proud in silence. A few weeks ago, a local journalist asked me what I think justice looks like. Is it watching your son face consequences? She asked. Is it the public recognition? I thought about it for a long time before answering. Justice, I said, is waking up and no longer feeling ashamed of having trusted the wrong people. It's choosing to speak, knowing it might cost you love, but knowing you're gaining something far more important, self-respect. It's knowing that even if nothing changes around you, everything has changed within you. She blinked twice, then whispered, That's not the answer I expected. I nodded. It rarely island. People like me aren't taught to be loud. We're taught to be grateful, to endure, to avoid conflict for the sake of harmony. But harmony built on silence is a cage, and I refuse to live in cages anymore. Not emotional ones, not legal ones, not familial ones. My freedom didn't come from punishing my son, it came from choosing to stop rewarding his betrayal. And that choice, I've learned, inspires others more than any courtroom ever could. The Morales Foundation is now preparing its annual conference. We're calling it the Age of Voice. Seniors from all 50 states will be flying in. Some will speak for the first time publicly about the ways they've been manipulated, dismissed, erased. Some will sit quietly in the back, not yet ready to share, but finally beginning to listen to themselves again. We've partnered with universities, advocacy groups, even police departments. For the first time, elder abuse isn't being whispered about behind closed doors. It's being studied, addressed, confronted. I'm proud of that. But I'm prouder still that every bit of it was born from one moment of truth in a ballroom. One decision not to shrink, not to give in, not to let them write the ending. I still haven't seen Oliver in person. But I receive updates now, clipped moments from a mutual friend who remains in quiet contact with Vanessa. He's growing fast. Big eyes. Fierce laugh. There's a photo on my desk of him in a blue raincoat, stomping through puddles with total joy. I look at it often, not with longing, but with hope. Hope that one day, when he's old enough to ask his own questions, he'll find answers untainted by bitterness. I've written him a letter every few months. I don't send them. I seal them and place them in a box. Someday, they'll be his, not as proof of who I was, but as a map of who he can choose to become. As evening sets in, I open the window and let the breeze in. Somewhere below, someone is laughing carefree, bright, unburdened. I close my eyes and breathe it in. I'm not the man who was slapped in a ballroom. I'm the man who stood back up, walked out, and built something sacred from the shards. Not revenge, not righteousness, just something whole. This is what survival looks like. This is what healing sounds like. And this quiet, steady, rooted life is what justice feels like. This evening, as twilight spilled gently across the windowsill, and the city settled into its evening hush, I found myself pulling out the old leather-bound journal I started the week after the wedding, that terrible, defining week. Back then, it was just a place to pour the grief, a private witness to the unraveling of a life I thought I understood. But now, as I flipped through its worn pages, I didn't see grief. I saw growth. Line after line, scrawled in midnight ink and early morning resolve, charted the journey of a man who stopped asking why others had failed him and started asking how he could show others they didn't have to fail themselves. There's a strange peace that comes when you stop trying to fix what someone else broke. It doesn't happen overnight. It sneaks in. First as silence that doesn't ache, then as solitude that doesn't sting. Eventually, it becomes clarity, a new kind of confidence that doesn't depend on who's in your life, but on who you've become without them. That's the part no one tells you about reclaiming your power. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. It's quiet, unapologetic, a morning where your hands don't tremble when you drink your coffee. A night where you fall asleep without rehearsing arguments that never got resolved. I've spent the last 2 years learning what it means to live for myself, not in a selfish way, but in a sacred one. To trust that peace is a worthy companion. To believe that dignity is not just for the young and the bold, but for the weathered and wise. I've watched lives change in the wake of mine, not because I demanded anything from the world, but because I dared to tell it the truth. That sometimes the greatest courage isn't forgiving others. It's forgiving yourself for staying too long, for hoping too much, for loving someone who saw you as a resource instead of a refuge. Next week, I'll speak at a summit in Washington, D.C., where lawmakers will debate stronger protections for elders. They'll quote statistics, outline policy proposals, point to budgets, and then they'll call my name, and I'll walk to the podium not as an activist, but as a reminder that behind every data point is a person who once sat in the dark wondering if they were crazy for feeling used. I won't give them outrage. I'll give them story. Because facts inform, but stories move. Stories make it real. And when I return home, I'll hang my jacket, water the plants, and sit with Raymond on the balcony while Sophie reads aloud the latest draft of her curriculum. We'll talk about the people we couldn't save and the ones we did. We'll toast with tea, not champagne. And we'll know, without needing to say it, that what we built out of the ashes was never about revenge. It was about reclamation, of voice, of value, of self. Some nights, I still hear echoes of footsteps walking away, of doors closing too hard, of silence stretched too long between family members who once shared everything. But they don't haunt me anymore. They just remind me of what I've learned. That love without respect is just manipulation. That aging doesn't mean fading, and that starting over doesn't need anyone's permission but your own. This life I'm living now, it's not the one I planned. But it's honest, and it's mine, fully, finally, quietly radiant, in a way I never imagined possible. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of something deep within yourself or someone you care about, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we share powerful, real-life stories that matter, stories that speak to dignity, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life when the world expects you to stay silent. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel. You're joining a growing community of thoughtful, courageous people who believe that age doesn't diminish value and that standing up for yourself is always worth it, even if you have to stand alone at first. We publish new stories every week, each one crafted with care, each one grounded in truth, emotion, and purpose. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're lifelines, reflections, and in some cases, roadmaps. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notifications so you never miss a story that might change the way you see your past, your future, or your worth. And while you're here, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? What part of this story resonated with you most? Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and most of all, thank you for choosing stories that speak to the heart. We'll see you in the next one with love, respect, and truth.